Hey Travis, how's it going? I think you might be muted.
Yep. Yep. There,
There
I
we
found
go.
it. All right. I
How's it
recently
going?
switched to Mac, so I'm like, okay, where's everything at? It pretty much looks the same though. So
Awesome, right on. Good to see you, man. It's been a little while since I think we've chatted.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely been a minute. Things have been going good. Got basically two careers between the writing and then doing the financial advisor thing. So, but
Amazing.
been working with David Whitney Jr. on a script, which we're just about done with to submit to my manager, and Zero Gravity, and then moving forward with that. So
Oh,
good
that's
stuff.
awesome. Love it. Well, cool. Well, let's kick things off. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this webinar. We have Travis Lemke here, who is part of the Roadmap Writer alum crew, signed with literary manager at Zero Gravity. As you just heard from him a moment ago, he's doing awesome things. So just to kind of go over a couple of things. What's up, Eric? How are you? So there's a couple of boxes here. There is the chat box. That is where you can just say hello. You can do all that good stuff. And then there's also a Q&A box. So now the Q&A box is if you do have a specific question that you would like to ask at some point. We may just circle back to some of those a little bit later. But that's where you're going to put those, and you feel free if you have questions throughout the throughout this conversation, you can put them in there now, and then we can always try to get back to them a little bit later. So yeah, so now that we've got that all situated, yeah, let's kick things off. 49ers, I see. Okay, are you guys still undefeated? Oh, I think we lost Travis. Let's see. Give me one moment, everyone. There we go. All right, Travis. Cool. I mean, just to kick it off, being a writer, you're a storyteller. So can you tell us how you first started writing and creating stories?
Wow. When I first started, it was pretty much, I think a lot of writers, at least myself, like growing up, as you go through things, like you kind of have that urge, just like with painting or music or, I have my hands in music. I used to do graphic art. But you just kind of have it in the back of your mind. It's like, hey, I would like to be a writer someday, or that just sounds cool. Or you have that impetus to do that, right? That compulsion. But it was really about 2005 that I started writing my first screenplay and getting into it. And it's just been an evolution since then, like using, I think my first screenplay I wrote like on WordPad or something. Didn't really know what the margins were supposed to be. And it was just, a really sloppy whatever effort, but it was still, just like when you do your first drawing or you learn your first chord on a guitar or an instrument, that was the starting point.
Got it. And so it was with screenwriting. So it wasn't through like another medium or anything like that. Like you weren't writing for a blog or like anything like that. It was just, you just made the jump right to screenwriting.
I had won some awards in high school and college for writing, and so that's part of it as well. But yeah, the first foray into any like I'm going to write this for myself versus like a school assignment was screenwriting. I got like at a friend's garage sale. I think it was one of the Sid Field books.
Yeah.
Screenwriting. It was the first book that I had, and so yeah, that's what started it off was that Sid Field book.
I love that. And you found out at a garage sale. Like that's like, it could have been anything. It could have been like I don't know, engineering or something, and you could have gone that route. But that's awesome. And then I know you've also written novels as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
So
two novels.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like when did that come into play for you?
That actually, I wrote these screenplays for them first, and I used the screenplays as the outline for the novels. I got my first option. Wait, you still there? You froze. So I don't know if you can hear me or not. Here. Yeah, okay, just make sure. Yeah, you froze. So I wasn't sure. But yeah, the novels came out of the screenplays. I wrote the screenplays first. Then I had gotten optioned in 2010, and something happened between the producer and the director, and the film didn't get made. So I got a little dejected. I was like, oh, I'm going to try novels now. So I started writing the novels based on the screenplay. One of the novels was required reading for English Lit students at Monmouth University. Had really good reviews, and I'm actually trying to I just self-published them. But with my manager now at Zero Gravity, he does have some, connections in that world. So now I'm in the process of trying to get those republished and kind of polished up. But the critical reviews and editorial reviews on them both were really good. And, it only helps, engage your passion. If you enjoy writing, then write. You're going to do what you enjoy. And regardless of, like, obviously you want success, but I mean, if you're passionate about something, whether it's music, whether it's writing, whether it's art, then do it for you, first of all, and then with screenwriting, obviously there's a lot that goes along with it in terms of knowing how the industry works, knowing how to pitch your projects, and novels too. And I'm sure music, but yeah, that's where the novels came from.
That's really cool. So it's like it's so funny. The inspiration for everything first started with the screenplay and then came the novels. Sometimes you hear it's the other way around, but you do also hear about, writers who they sort of write their novel based on sort of using that same sort of template that you mentioned, which is you have a blueprint for the book already, right? Conceivably, right. As long as the story is there and can endure for a couple hundred pages, right?
Well, right. And plus, I was a little bit lazy, some of the smartest people are the laziest people because they look for the easiest way to do things. So it's like, 120-page screenplay max. Yeah, that's a lot better than trying to write a 200-300-page novel, right? So you're like, okay, I have a story here and I want to tell this story. So it was also an easier medium, maybe not easier in the bigger picture now that I know more, but at least at the time to me it's like, okay, this is a much more tighter window. And just being half raised by the television, kind of a little more glitter or glamour regarding the screenplay versus novel, at least initially in my mind.
Yeah. What was the, I know you made reference to being raised half by TV. What were some of those early shows that you watched that sort of like you feel informed your writing like years later?
Oh, geez. I don't know. I remember probably like the Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond, some of those creepier ones. But, I also watched all the cheeky or cheesy sitcoms, Gilligan's Island, Hogan's Heroes, Alice. And then, I actually enjoyed watching some of the nighttime dramas like Dynasty and Flamingo Road and things like that. I actually got to meet the creators of Dynasty, a good friend of mine. That's her parents. And when I went to LA for my first round of journal meetings, I stayed at her house. And that's when I first found that her parents wrote the Dynasty series in the 80s. And so I got to go have lunch with them and stuff. And that was super cool. Because I was like, I actually enjoyed those shows. So,
yeah. In terms of, I'd love to actually talk a little bit about your first script. So what was the first script you ever wrote? And like, what year did you sort of finish that first draft?
That was probably like 2006, 2007 when my first script. It's never like it's shit. Not to put too fine a point. I mean, it was interesting. Is there's nothing else like it out there? That's for sure. But that first script, and sometimes some of these first script is great. The second script that I wrote was the one that got optioned in 2010. Nice. So, it can go any which way. But yeah, that first one that I wrote was definitely a learning experience just to kind of, break your teeth, so to speak, put it out there, see how the medium works. But I tried to do two, it was like 3 or 4 different genres in one script. So it was definitely not a script for a first-time writer in retrospect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right. That's like that first one, especially there's a lot of those growing pains as you're just figuring out sort of the format and just, it's a new medium to you. So, yeah, I mean, looking back at it, or I guess I should say at the time when you wrote it, did you think you're like, oh, this is amazing. This is great. And it wasn't like,
yeah, okay. I was like, wow, I fucking did this thing, man. This is awesome. Like, this has to get made, right? And then you give it to people and they're like, well, that's interesting, and then obviously I think I used Scripts Blaster at first, right, to get it out there. Mm-hmm. And apparently my sales pitch was good because I did actually get people to look at it and got some responses. But then it was like crickets after that, nothing, no feedback, nothing. It was just nothing. And then over time, after I wrote that second one, it's been a slow process, between day-to-day life and everything, writing that first script way back in 05, 06. And then just, it really didn't ramp up until the last, 2-3 years for me to really put everything into it and make sure that I was understanding what I'm doing. understanding not only the level of craft, because you can always have creativity, you can always have artistic vision, but understanding the level of craft and understanding how the industry works in terms of how to approach that correctly was a journey. And that's what really ramped up in the last couple of years. Because the first end of it, it was just about the creativity and I'm going to do whatever I want and I don't give a damn what the rules are. Learn that there are rules and to accept those and to apply those correctly. And roadmaps has been obviously like a godsend for that.
That's awesome. I'm curious, as you from that first script that you ever wrote to whatever you're working on right now, while I'm sure you learned a lot and a lot has changed for the better, is there anything that, to your surprise, that you did as part of your writing process from that first script that has stayed with you even till now?
Yeah, just being passionate about what you're writing about. Like you got a voice, like you have to have voice, authenticity, professionalism. Those are all things that are going to make you a successful writer. But voice being the first one, like having a creative voice and speaking from your heart and speaking from your experience. That was in that first script still. It's just a little bit too much all over the place. But staying true to not only what's going to help you be successful, in my opinion, but it's also going to keep you passionate about whatever you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, because you bring up a really interesting point about voice, and I know it's something that a lot of writers struggle with. What do you feel that sort of authenticity, and you feel like you've had that since your first story? Can you talk a little bit about sort of why you feel so strongly that give us an example of the voice of your voice that you brought into your work?
Well, in my case, this isn't true with every writer. Every writer's got to find their voice. But to me, a writer, so you're a student of people, right? So throughout your life, you've always been a close observer of the way people behave, the way they act, the way they speak. I mean, that's what enables you to write good dialogue and create authentic characters. Myself, I battled drug addiction when I was younger, got over that, mid-20s, went into business after that, and got my schooling done. And then about the time I was a little bit before 30 years old, I got sick of that and I gave everything away and I decided to hitchhike around the country for 5 years. And just all those experiences are like what I draw on from a writer. But even if you grew up in a family of 2.5 children in the suburbs and, did everything, the right way, quote unquote, if you're a writer, you're still drawing either from the other books that you've read, the screenplays that you've read, because I was an avid reader, read a lot of horror, read a lot of, I like Tom Robbins, Hunter S. Thompson. Big influences, was all into media, watched a lot of movies. Even if you're just a person who hasn't even been well read, you just watched a lot of movies and you really enjoy cinema, then that's your experience. Draw from those experiences to find your voice, to breathe life into those characters. And that's what it is. That's your voice. Your voice is whatever allows you to breathe life into what you're putting onto that page.
Love it. Throughout your time writing, what has been one of the hardest lessons for you to sort of learn throughout this entire process?
The hardest lesson. There's a few hard lessons. There's more than one. The hardest one really is staying persistent. Like Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be persistent. You've got to be willing to keep learning, keep listening. And again, getting back to, that's where roadmaps has been invaluable, because you can get opinions from all types of people, but getting opinions from people that actually work in the industry, actually made things and actually do this, that's invaluable. And so you have to be willing to listen and learn. But the biggest challenge, getting directly to your point, is persistence. You have to be persistent and you can't give up. You've got to keep your hands around the throat of whatever it is you're going after, and you can't let go.
And then were there some, was there a trick or a tactic that you sort of employed to stay persistent?
I'm just raised by my grandmother. I'm a stubborn German. Irish person, so I guess for whatever it's worth, just being stubborn. Like, it's okay to be stubborn, but you can't let your stubbornness not let you listen to criticism. You have to be able to accept criticism.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to listen. And so there's a balance there. So there's going to be times where you're going to disagree or you feel like you need to stay true to your vision. But there's also times where you need to listen as well. But yeah, that's the biggest challenge is, being persistent and being willing to learn. Because unfortunately, you can't just be a good writer. You got to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to sell yourself. You have to be able to sell your script. You have to be able to be in a room with people, especially TV, potentially in a writer's room. But even with feature film, like right now, I'm having to go back and forth with the producer. He gives me notes, and they like the first draft, but there's always going to be rewrites. It's very rarely, even for an established writer, are you going to put something out there on your first draft or even your second draft? They're going to be like, okay, it's good to go. Like, you're going to have to be able to work through that and work as a team. And so that's where you can't be too stubborn is what I'm getting back to. But to get to that point where you are working with people, that's going to lay the foundation for your ability to work with them. So that's why you can't be too stubborn, be persistent, but listen as well. So the balance between persistence, a certain degree, healthy degree of stubbornness, but at the same time, that willingness to learn and adapt is going to be important too. It's not the strongest and the smartest of the species that survive. It's the most adaptable to change.
I love that. In terms of, you bring up something interesting is the idea of, the collaborative experience and getting notes. And, what sort of, is there something that you find like now, what is that experience like getting notes and dealing with notes, especially when you're being hired for something as opposed to just, getting maybe constructive feedback from peers or for others? Do you find that there's a difference at all between the two different experiences now?
There are some important differences, I think. Whenever you're just getting general feedback, like through roadmaps or through another source, critiques, you need to look for consistencies because it's a very subjective industry. And you're going to find some things that you agree with and you think are great ideas, and that's great. But you're also going to run into things that you don't agree with. And you don't necessarily need to automatically assume that you need to change your whole script. Get feedback from, I would say at least 3 different sources and see where there's consistency. And if there's consistency and, this needs to change, take that very seriously. But until you see that consistency, feel free to take certain things with a grain of salt if you don't necessarily agree with them. Whenever you're working on an active project with a producer or a director or other writers, you already have a certain level of credential, so to speak. So in that regard, you don't need to, it depends. Like, if you're writing the script just yourself and the producer, the director comes back to you, yes, you need to take that very seriously, I think. And you need to talk with them. And you're going to have that opportunity for a lot more dialogue versus just reading someone's notes or having 1 10-minute session where they give you the feedback. You're going to have a real conversation with them. It's like, okay, what are you looking for here? What are we talking about? So you make sure you understand their criticism more, not criticism, but their critique more, or what they're wanting to see changed. And you have a lot better understanding of that. You see the reason behind it and the overall direction that they're wanting the script to go, because they're invested in it. They're not just giving you feedback. This is your
skin in the game. Right. Yeah.
You're a team on this. And so you're all trying to achieve that goal together. So that's a very different dynamic.
Cool. In terms of, making, I know you mentioned at the start of this that sort of you're also in the financial sector. How has that been for you, sort of making that transition to writer? I mean, is it something that you want to just do full on, or are you looking to do you still find a lot of passion in the financial world? Like where,
That's actually fairly recent. I was doing the writing before I've kind of evolved into the financial sector.
Okay.
The things that actually correspond between that and the writing is a lot of this industry, writing and the financial sector, is based on trust. And if you're acting in the best interest of your client, if you're acting in the best interest of that director or that producer or your manager, because if you get an agent, you get a manager, you're working for them just as much as they're working for you. So it's all about that trust. And what are you doing for them? And are you acting in their best interests? just as much as it is up to them to act in your best interest. But that kind of bled over into the financial realm, because as a fiduciary agent, you have a legal responsibility to act in the best interest of the client. But, I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma. I've always taken that seriously. Good old farm boy attitude. You don't fuck with the person's money. You don't mess with their family either. So I take that attitude into what I do as a financial advisor, and I take that attitude into whatever I'm going to do, because when you have respect and trust amongst your peers, that means everything. That's the harmony and the magic that makes everything happen, no matter what you're doing in life, in my opinion.
Well said. I have a question, because a lot of writers always they find themselves at this sort of crossroad at some point during their journey, and it's whether or not they should make a move to be in LA or New York. What sort of advice would you have, or would you give to someone who is sort of maybe finding themselves at that crossroad and wondering, hey, should I make the move from wherever they may be to LA or to New York? To be in closer proximity to the industry?
That's kind of depends on their situation. I would say if you're financially capable of doing that and you have the means to do that, and you're really serious about being a writer and breaking into that industry, in my opinion, it will make things a little bit easier. Anytime you can step into a room with somebody versus even doing Skype or doing Zoom or doing a phone call, that makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. So the more you're around town meeting people saying, I'm a screenwriter, you have to take on that identity and let that stick. And yeah, it can't help. So if you're able to do that and you don't have any, my situation was a little bit different where I needed to be close to my children. But if you have that ability, then yeah, I think it's not going to lessen your chances, and it's definitely going to improve them a bit as well.
Cool.
But not stop them.
Right.
But not cut it off totally. I mean, so
yeah.
By any means.
In terms of sort of your experience, taking meetings in LA, can you talk to us a little bit about what that was like? And feel free to even, talk about maybe even some of the virtual meetings that you had with executives as well. But just talk a little bit about that, and just some sort of lessons and tips that you sort of acquired through this process.
It was a lot of fun to come to, the biggest thing, especially with going to LA. I mean, even if you're living there, or especially if you're coming from outside of there and going there and doing the meetings, the biggest thing that it did for me is it made me fully realize, okay, the shit's real now. I can actually do this. I know I'm good in a room. I know I'm good talking to people, but until you actually go on these general meetings and you're sitting there, I met Lawrence Bender at his house in freaking Beverly Hills or wherever it was, so and he made the Tarantino movies, which I loved, and obviously, so you have the opportunity to meet some big names or even some small names. That's really not what it's about. When you go into the meeting, you got to have treat the janitor the same as you would the CEO type attitude. Everybody you meet, be polite, be professional, be genuine, and be yourself, and be passionate about your work. And because when you go into a general meeting, it's not going to be tell me about your writing right away. There's going to be a little bit of just shooting the shit. Hey, tell me a little bit about yourself and this and that. And just be yourself, be genuine. And especially if you can even tie that to your writing, oh, I did this, talk about something interesting about yourself. And even if you're boring, be like, yeah, you know what? I'm actually a pretty boring person, but I've been watching TV and movies since I was 5 years old. And I love this show and I love this show. And I'm totally into this one right now. Just be yourself. And that carries everything. So the biggest thing out of general meetings is breathe. They're human beings. Nobody's a fire-breathing dragon. They're just human beings. And treat everybody nice, like you would want to be treated. And be yourself and be professional. And, when they start dropping F-bombs, maybe you can start dropping F-bombs then. But I try not, and I'm not a foul mouth person, so I swear a lot. I don't think I've written, have I written a PG movie? I think I have one PG movie. Everything else is R-rated. But, yeah, be professional, be polite, be yourself. And by being yourself, you're showing them your voice. You're giving them, you're showing a window to your voice by being yourself. So tie your voice into how that is you when you're in that general meeting. And then they're going to get a sense of that, and that's going to make them want to see your script, make them see your movie, just based on those things, as long as you guys gel and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious because obviously, over the course of this process of for you writing and eventually landing representation, I'm sure you were very focused on at different points and establishing and developing your brand in terms of the types of stories that you tell and who you are as a storyteller. And I'm curious, did that, maybe not so like directly like, hey, what is your brand? But did that sort of ever come up in meetings, or did you feel that having a strong identity and an understanding of that played to your advantage going into some of these meetings?
Having a strong identity definitely played into it a big way. Nobody specifically asked about brand, but that's at least not in any of my face-to-face journal meetings, but like between all of the meetings, it does come up. Like I've had that question asked a few times, what is your brand? And my brand, you can think about this over time. It was like, mine was the new ordinary. They're like, well, what do you mean by the new ordinary? It's like, well, LGBT is more in the forefront. This is more in the forefront. The opioid crisis, which is what I'm writing about now, that's a big thing. Like all these things that are ordinary, because what am I trying to say? Okay, one of the big paradigms in writing is ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, right? That's the basic premise of almost everything. It's like fish out of water, people facing, what's an ordinary person? An ordinary person in the 1940s is not the same thing as an ordinary person now. So writing about millennials, writing about the LGBTQ community, writing about those new ordinaries is kind of one of my shticks. But even when you don't know what your brand is, you can still relate to that individual, that agent, that manager, that producer that you're talking to, where your inspiration comes from. Where does your voice come from? And as long as you remain true to that, then you're able to create a visual imprint of what your brand actually is, even if you don't specifically have it nailed down to one or two sentences.
I'm curious, so many writers are perfectionists, and through that, there's always this sort of nervousness or this anxiety about actually putting your work out there, right? Putting it in the world, getting it in the hands of folks. Do you have any feelings when it comes to that, or an advice that you would give to someone who maybe is like struggling with that, the idea of just sharing your work and, is it ever really perfect?
No, it's never really perfect. Like what's that David Bowie line? They'll reject your best in that song Fame. So whenever you think it's the best thing in the world, somebody else is going to think it's shit, and vice versa. You could have something that you think is shit and somebody else thinks it's the best thing you ever read. There was like, what was that one case in Roadmaps? There was a guy or a girl, I don't actually know the gender, but they had somebody tell Joey it was the worst script they'd ever read. And like a week or two later, somebody else said it was the best script they ever read. That person got signed. So don't get too hung up, I think, on making it perfect, because nobody knows what that is. Like even William Goldberg, one of the greatest screenwriters of all time, Princess Bride, Chinatown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that nobody in Hollywood knows anything. So which isn't necessarily true, but his point being that you never know how that script or that idea is going to be received. So no, don't focus too much on being perfectionist. There's always going to be rewrites. Don't ever be afraid to put it out there. You have to put it out there. You have to let the criticism, the critiques, using roadmaps or whatever resources you have to get those critiques, that has to be the rock that you break yourself against. And I don't mean break yourself in a bad way, but I mean that you learn to accept that, and it's going to make you stronger. It's the tires don't grab the road without friction, and you're going to need friction to get anywhere. So I would say embrace that. If you're afraid of that, get over it and get it out there. And that's going to be, if that's a hurdle for you, you need to get over that right away and get your work out there.
Yeah. It's interesting because you're so right. And almost nearly every executive has a story like this. I remember like over a decade ago, I was in a general meeting and I was sitting across from an executive who, he was like, oh yeah, I passed on the King's Speech, which, it ended up, I think, winning best picture. Right. And everybody has that story. And you're right. It is sometimes it's it is very subjective. And so, you know, something can be in one, like just be regarded so highly in one hand. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh no, I'm sorry. This is terrible. I don't like it. But you know, ideally there's somewhere in the middle where a lot of people are supporting and understanding sort of the story that you're trying to tell or things like that. But you're right. There's this wide spectrum of opinions and things like that. And you're only going to really know once you get out there. I always think of it too, like, I was never good at standardized testing, but standardized testing is like, the whole point of it is to sort of see where you stack up with everyone else. And so at least putting your work out there, like you're saying, you get feedback, you get some criticisms, and it's only going to make you better. Right. So
exactly.
No, I love that. I think that's great.
Same thing happened to the Beatles. The first American exec to listen to the Beatles album was like, they're not going to be anything. They're not going to happened to the freaking Beatles. F. Scott Fitzgerald, I think he got turned down 150 times before he got his first yes.
Wow.
So, yeah, persistence and yeah, exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. In terms of writing, you know, did you have any formal training in screenwriting, or are you self-taught? Sort of, what did you do to get down to the basics and make sure that you really felt you had a good grasp on that?
Self-taught. So yeah, it started with a Sid Field book. I think I was using Microsoft Word for probably, in the first 10 years, it was really just a hobby. You know, like I said, it started in 2005. It was 2016 where I really dug in after I'd written the novels and was like, you know what, I really want to do this screenwriting thing. And I was in a place financially where I could really afford to devote to it full time as well. Mm-hmm. So it's really just been this last 3-4 years that I've really dove into it. And so up until that point, you know, my formatting, you know, the margins, I knew I had to use 12-point Courier font, you know, but other than that, it was like not what it was supposed to be. So once I understood the importance of that, like I only use Final Draft now. I know a lot of people debate, oh, should you use Final Draft or these other programs? Like everybody in the industry uses Final Draft. If you don't like it, that's fine. Make sure whatever you are using is compatible with Final Draft, because they're expecting it to look like that, and you're working with other people and they want the rewrites. When you have the asterisks that mark where the rewrites are, or whichever version of it, if it's not compatible, then it's just going to cause you things. So however you feel about Final Draft, you should at least have it in your toolbox, and be prepared to use it. So getting to where I'm just using Final Draft, obviously that's part of it. Blake, I can't remember his name, Save the Cat.
Blake Snyder?
Yeah, Blake Snyder. That was a great book to read. That was recommended to me. Whenever I really started getting on the right path, I was paying for consultations. Dan Snyder, I used him a lot. He's great. He was the reader. He worked on Sixth Sense. He was one of the readers for that helped got that produced, a number of other films. He's actually been on Roadmaps once or twice. But Dan Snyder I used. And that's where you really start to understand how that beat sheet matters. You know, you got to see this by page 10. You know, your first 10 pages are so important. Your first 3 pages are important, but those first 10, you know, we got to see this by approximately page 30. You know, it's going to vary from a 90-minute movie to a 120-minute movie. But understanding where those beats are supposed to fall, that's the craft that I've alluded to earlier. Like creativity, great. Vision, great. Voice, great. All good things. But you also have to understand that it's a craft. And that's where I think Roadmaps has been indispensable. Getting feedback from execs, getting the opportunity to learn how you're supposed to pitch, that's a big part of it. But just in terms of the writing, nailing the craft, you know, because you can be good with a saw, you can be good with a hammer, but that doesn't mean you know how to build a house.
Mm-hmm. I love all your analogies. I get them. I'm always like, oh, that's a really good one. That's why I write it down. Like the one that you said before about like the tires and friction on the road. I'm like, write that down. It's really good. No, but that's really well put.
I write fortune cookies in my spare time.
Is there something that you think that it's like a common mistake that maybe a lot of writers make in terms of when they're sort of trying to break in, that you also maybe sort of subscribe to and then realized after the fact, you're like, oh no, it's more like this. Did you ever have anything like that? Or what would you say is something that sort of checks that box?
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed the first half of that. You cut out just briefly. So
Sure. Is there anything in particular that you think for a writer who's trying to break in that, that you had a preconceived idea of what that it was going to be like, and then now that you've actually there, you're like, oh no, it's it's different, and that so maybe a writer who maybe sort of made that same journey, what would you say to that?
When you get signed, even by a producer, if it's they want to greenlight your movie, even if it's a greenlit movie, but especially with an agent or a manager, that's when your hard work starts. It's not where it ends. Like you have to do as much for them, like I said earlier, as they do for you. There's no instant gratification. Like, yeah, we can read about these stories where this person won a contest and all of a sudden they got, this multi-million-dollar deal, but that's the equivalent of winning the lottery. Understanding that being a screenwriter is work. It's not instant gratification. Like, oh, I wrote this script, or I wrote these few scripts and I got this one made and now it's all, rainbows and butterflies from here on out, because that's not the case. It's where you're going, not where you've been, that matters. Mm-hmm. And so keeping that in mind, and if you're in this just because you think you're going to be famous, go ask people how many famous screenwriters can they name. Because people say that to me. It's like, oh, you're a screenwriter, you're going to be famous. I'm like, how many famous screenwriters can you name? And they're like, Steven Spielberg is like, oh, he wrote scripts, but he's obviously a director, right? What straight up screenwriter? How many can you name? Nobody can name any. There's no famous screenwriters. So you shouldn't be in this to be famous. You should be into this because you love your craft and you love your art. And that's why. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing that, it's great to have it in the back of your mind, but that should not be your true motivation for doing this, or otherwise I don't think you're really going to get anywhere. Mm-hmm. And then other perception, no, over time, sure, because all those things we've already talked about, like understanding that you have to accept criticism, you have to learn the craft. It's not just write the script, it's all these other factors. It's just been such a cumulative process. It's kind of hard for me to think back to those aforementioned rainbows and butterflies in my head, which that's great for a start. That's why we all start doing it, right? We want our work to be on that screen. Mm-hmm. And that's great. But understanding the reality that it takes to get there is a whole other thing. Like the destination, sure, but it's really about the journey, right? So
in terms of, I'd love to, if you could sort of take us to the first meeting, or the signing meeting that you ended up having with Zero Gravity. Can you sort of, paint that picture for us? Tell us a little bit how that meeting went down, and ultimately how you knew that this was going to be a good fit.
It was through one of the top tier sessions with Roadmaps. Joe Riley. I had submitted a couple of different options for him to check out. One of them was my horror movie.
Was that The Killer John Bidwell?
Yeah, actually, the current working title is A Necessary Shedding of Skin. But yes, it's the Bidwell script. But we've both been pitching that, and that's what got me this assignment with David Whitney, which we're working on a script together. And that's another thing to think about is, a lot of times it's not going to be your script. It's the first one made. A lot of times you're going to get a writing assignment, and you're going to have to write something with somebody else. And that is becoming more and more the case versus, oh, they're just going to make my script. At least with feature film. Like TV could be a little bit different, obviously. But just be prepared for that, be willing to accept that. But it was through a top tier session that I met Joe. And I knew it was going well whenever I realized about 2 months into it that he didn't just read the first 15 or 30 pages. He'd read the whole script because of the references that he was making. And when that started happening in top tier, where they're only required to read 10, 15, first act, whatever, but into the conversation, you realize they've read the whole thing. That means they wanted to keep reading the whole damn thing. And so when that happens, that, I want to say you've got your hooks in somebody, but there's some symbiosis there, right? Mm-hmm. And then he gave me some good advice. His notes were really good. His notes were poignant. They weren't just notes that I'd heard before. They all made sense to me. So whenever you're working with somebody or you're listening to somebody and they give you, they like your stuff, and B, they give you notes that you really communicate well with, and there's just really a good feeling all around, then that's a really good indicator. With Joe, he wanted me to send him another script as well. So that got me his email address. He wanted me to email him. And then it was about a month and a half, 2 months later, I hadn't heard anything from him. So I emailed him. I think after that amount of time, it's acceptable if they've given you their email address and you have their contact info. Don't be a pain in the ass. That's just going to get you shut down. I waited about a month and a half, said, hey, what did you think about that other script that I sent? Just curious, because I really enjoyed your notes from the Bidwell script. That initiated a phone call. His assistant emailed me back and said, Joe would like to speak with you. And then had the phone call. And he's like, halfway through this other script, love it. We want to bring you on board. And it's just been, working with him on the existing scripts that I have, working on this writing assignment now, because he's like, after reading your stuff, I have this other guy. He's looking for someone to do this project. We think it's got a huge amount of potential, even franchise potential. So I really want you to work with him on this. And that's what's led to where I'm at this point.
That's awesome. I love that.
If you have that connection, and don't bother them a week later, don't bother them 2 weeks later, give it a month, at least a month. Then maybe just drop a line like I did and say, hey, I'm just curious what you thought of that other one. Really enjoyed your notes. What do you think? And do that with all of your connections. Anybody that you've got an email from that you've had connection with, either through whether it's a 10-minute read, whether it's a month-long mentorship. My first mentorship was with Bobby Hoppy when he was at Echo Lake. And we still email every now and then. Just check in every now and then. Keep those connections open. Even if it's just say, hey, haven't talked to you in a while. How's it going? Because all of those things are what build your career and keep it moving forward. So that's just something to bear in mind later down the line or whenever you get to it.
No, that's great. And you mentioned a little bit before in top tier, were there, what opportunities did you feel that your time in top tier sort of afforded you that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise?
Oh God, I wouldn't be here probably without top tier, like maybe, but I think I mentioned Script Blast earlier. I don't know how many other writers are familiar with Script Blaster, but it was like this thing that I used in when I first started that you pay $35, $70, whatever, and it just emails 1,000 people. And out of that 1,000 people that you might get 5 responses. And yeah, sure, that's an opportunity. I mean, there's all kinds of script review services and everything out there, and I've been through the ringer on all of them. And I've done the fade-in thing, the fade-in pitch things, and that was okay, but I've never come across anything, and this is where I think roadmaps specifically, there's nothing else like it out there. It's hands down for somebody who is serious about becoming a screenwriter. There's nothing else that is as good as it, because not only does it help you nail your craft by giving you the feedback you need to make sure you have a market-ready script in the first place, it will teach you how to pitch to producers and executives, because great, you're a great writer, you got a great script, awesome. If you don't know how to pitch it and convey those ideas, it doesn't matter how good your script is, you have to be able to nail that pitch and know how you're supposed to do that, whether it's an elevator pitch, an 8-minute pitch, a 20-minute top tier pitch, or a general meeting. Nothing else out there gives you all of those tools to do that like Roadmaps does, in my opinion. And that's not just to float Roadmaps, but because I'm doing this interview right now, that's just a fact from a guy who's tried everything else out there. And some of it's okay, but if you got to spend your money somewhere, then Roadmaps, that's Screenwriter University. You guys need to change your name to SU. Have your own football team.
I appreciate that. Actually, one of the attendees actually just kind of dropped in the box a question. And I would just remind everybody, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, the Q&A box and not the chat box. And I think you sort of spoke to this a little bit, was just, his question was, in terms of getting in touch with executives or even coming across getting a project optioned, were there any other channels, or was it just through Roadmap, or did you have any other ways that you sort of built these inroads? Because I know that you did mention, I think it was that first script or second script that you wrote, I think you had option, and that was a while back.
Oh, right. Inktip. I don't know if people are familiar with that. That gives you the opportunity to put your script out there. That was through Inktip. I've actually had 2 or 3 decent connections, people I still talk to through Inktip. But with that, I mean, no criticism towards Inktip in any way, shape, or form, but you're definitely looking at your lower budget, your new producers. Like Roadmaps gives you the opportunity to talk to people who are established and who work for established companies in Hollywood. Inktip will give you the opportunity to talk with new producers and people whose budgets are pretty much going to be 5 million and under. So if your budget is over 5 million, like, yeah, there are scripts on Inktip that, you know, can be bigger, but like your chances, like you're just dealing with, it's a different level with Inktip. Like, I don't think it's a bad resource by any means. Of ISA, the International Screenwriters Association, you can get good feedback through them. I think they're a decent organization. What else would I say? Stage 32, I've heard mixed reviews on that. You do get the opportunity to talk with writers and producers, or not writers, but executives, managers, et cetera, through that. But so there's other things out there that can get you the opportunity to get in front of people. But I don't think there's anything out there that can give you all the tools in a complete sense that Roadmaps does. Because the first thing, and this is where Roadmaps is invaluable, the first thing you do is you get feedback. Like, you can get feedback from screenwriting services out there on the internet, but I would rather have feedback from an exec that works at Sony. I would rather have feedback from somebody that works at Warner Brothers, or a manager who works with Zero Gravity, or, you know, like, research these companies, and you're going to see which companies actually are making stuff and actively working in Hollywood. And if you can get your feedback from them, get your feedback from them. Once you've done that and you know you have a market ready script, that's step one. Step two is learning how to pitch your script properly. Otherwise, you're not going to get any traction no matter how it does that. And then step three is actually getting signed because you've learned step one and step two. And so ISA can do that for you in some regards, and Roadmaps can definitely do that. So in terms of teaching those steps, those are the two most valuable resources I found.
Cool. I was also going to ask you, actually, so we have a couple questions popping up here. One writer asked, over the course of your time, I guess is actually a good question. In terms of, let's just say, educating yourself on the craft and these different opportunities, whether it's been through Inktip or whatever, sort of, like, what kind of financial investment have you made in yourself throughout this process in terms of, like, dollars and cents? You know, is that something that, and I think you mentioned earlier, like, you at first, you weren't really that, it was, I think you phrased it as more of a hobby was your approach. And then when you started to focus on it, that you were like, okay, I'm going to be more committed. So was there sort of like, did you come up with a budget for yourself, or sort of how did you sort of find that balance?
Find that balance. Well, yeah, first, you know, I had used Inktip for a while, but Inktip is really expensive. It was like $60 every 6 months, you know, so it's not a huge investment just to throw a couple scripts on Inktip. Then when I realized, I guess, had enough confidence in myself to realize, hey, I could actually do something with this, and I want to do something with this. Then it did become a larger investment. I mean, it doesn't cost as much as going to a 4-year college per se.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I think the Hollywood Reporter recently just did, there was like the top 10 film schools, and, you know, like the SCs and UCLAs, like that's like 30, 40 grand. Yeah. Like it's insane. Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
You have great alumni things and whatnot. So obviously I think there's a lot of value in some of those for depending on for a certain individual. But yeah, I mean, that's a significant investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Roadmaps and even ISA, both of those are, you know, significant investments because, you know, it does cost some money to do that. And then there are things out there that I think they're just throwing your money away. A lot of the screenwriting evaluation services, like, I'm not going to name any specific or diss on any of them specific, but you don't know who's actually evaluating your script. Like, why pay the black, whatever, what the hell is it called? The blacklist. Like, why pay them $75 to have some unknown person evaluate your script? You don't even know who the hell it is. Whenever you can look up the person and know who it is, either through Roadmaps, definitely, it's like, okay, I know this is such and such exec. I know they work at this company, and they have the credentials. You know who you're dealing with. So you know you're at least getting feedback from somebody that's not just like an intern or a reader somewhere or whatever. So that's invaluable. So I don't know, I'm going to go to the farm boy thing again. You pay for what you get. So it's going to cost you a little bit of money to learn. I mean, or you do your own research and it takes a lot more time. But if you want to nail your craft in a couple years and really know where you stand, then yeah, I would say invest in roadmaps for sure. I don't know. It's been good to me. Again, I'm not sitting here trying to sell roadmaps, but I have no regrets about it. Make a budget. I think all in all, over the 2 years that I spent a lot of money, I probably spent 10 grand. I maybe spent 15, but I didn't spend 30 or 40,000 going to UCLA for 4 years, or 30,000 a year. So a lot less money than it would be if you did like what you're saying. You went to one of those film schools. And even then, when you go through the film school, you still got to go through the same ringer. Like, you're not anybody just coming out of film school. Maybe you can get an intern job and then build yourself up to, getting an assistant and so on and so forth. But if your passion is writing, then that's not necessarily an easier path. I'm not saying that's the wrong path for anybody to take. Do whatever you want. But in terms of like what roadmaps cost or ISA costs, or those are the only two that I can think of that would be worth it. Then it's not a very big investment when you look at the bigger picture, especially if you're serious about becoming a screenwriter.
Kind of switching gears a bit to your pages. Someone has a good question here. What is some of the, throughout your variety of different scripts you have, sort of some common feedback that you would get on like those first 8 to 10 pages? And let's maybe focus on sort of the critiques that you received on those first 8 to 10 pages.
It really would depend on the script. But the common critiques that you get, like, okay, well, just like, you got to know who's your main character, what are their goals, what are they up against? Those are the three basics. Like, who's your character, what are they up against, what's their goal? You got to have that in that first 10 pages, and then no later than page 12, in my opinion, if we're going to go by the Blake Snyder thing, some kind of inciting incident, some kind of call to action, perhaps. But that's the three fundamentals. Who's your character? What are they up against? What are they trying to accomplish? Same things you want in your log line.
Cool. In terms of pitching, someone asked, do you ever pitch with visuals or without?
I've just gone on sheer force of personal nature and have not used visuals. I'm also a musician, so I had the fun idea once, like, oh, I should write a song about what the script is and just like sit up there like Adam Sandler or something and like do it that way for one of my comedies, which I never had the balls to do. Still don't think it's a bad idea. But, other than that, nope, I never used visuals. If you do have visuals and you're a graphic designer and you've got good ones and you can use those, especially if you're in a person-to-person meeting, I don't know if it's something you want to bring up on the screen or not. Don't see anything issue with that. A lot of people say, even for your film, if you're a writer-director and you have the ability to make a trailer or make a clip, like that's how, what's the Billy Bob Thornton movie, Sling Blade? Like that was just a very short little snippet with Molly Ringwald actually being the interviewer in the original version of that got that film made. So if you have the ability to make a trailer, produce some material, yeah, sure, why not? But for me personally, no, that's not what I use. But if you do that, make sure it's fucking good.
Yeah, you don't want to go necessarily up with stick figures or something, right? That might not
right.
might not necessarily sell the vision.
Right.
The question. So, in terms of and something someone wrote in is the time period from like getting that first option from when you option your script. Typically, what is that payment table like? And so for some writers who might find themselves in a position where they might be on the verge of optioning or negotiating an option, what's the timeline between that option and a paycheck?
typically, like you can get option first. Then if it's greenlit, that's great. Sometimes before it gets greenlit, you're just sitting there in option. Now, there's going to be a big difference between like an independent studio, very low budget, and like getting signed by Warner Brothers. So big pay gap difference there. It can be anywhere from 10 grand that maybe you get or less even, especially for shorts. That's not even on option. That's once they actually start shooting it. And I'll get back to that in a second. And then, obviously we've heard the great stories, $250,000, sign the contract, everything's golden. But typically you'll sign an option first. If it's really a big studio, I believe sometimes you'll get 10% of whatever the option price is just for signing your name on the line. But until it goes into production, which is called principal photography or onset of principal photography, that's generally whenever you get the initial check for the screenplay. And then the royalty percentage that you get after that can be anywhere from 1.5 to, if you're lucky, up to 3%. I would say 2 to 2.5% royalty is typically what you're going to get, and that's going to be contingent upon how well the movie does after that. And then a lot of times you're going to be potentially writing on spec. You're not going to get paid anything until that movie is actually gets onset of principal photography. And for that to happen between the timeline between getting an option and the start of principal photography can vary greatly, quite honestly. Because they have to send out what's called LOIs, letters of intent. They need to get the actors, they get, set directors, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that can happen relatively quickly. Sometimes it can take a little bit of time. So just don't ever think that once you got optioned, once you have an agent, have a manager, that it's instant success like I alluded to earlier. There's no instant gratification. Everything moves at glacial speed. And you just got to get used to it. But you also need to realize momentum is important. And anything that you can do to contribute to the momentum of your picture, whether you're a writer, director, or just a writer, that's always key. I think as well, because momentum is important and everybody needs to stay excited and focused on the project. And if you have that going for you, then that's a great thing. But in terms of your cash payoff from your screenplay, depending on the size of the production, depending on how well the movie does, you're looking at anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million. I mean, it just depends.
Yeah. And so and a lot of that, like you're saying, it just really depends on the size of the project and the budget. That's going to really dictate that first sort of option fee, right? So it's
but generally, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but generally you don't get paid anything really. I mean, sometimes you can just for optioning, but generally it's still onset of principal photography.
Yeah, that's usually where you get that larger chunk.
That's not where you get optioned, but whenever you start the actual photography and start the movie. Yeah,
cool. Question in terms of your writing, do you genre hop a lot, or do you stay in a lane? Like, are you a horror guy now?
I genre hop. I've got a variety of genres. I have 11 scripts. I have 12 now. So always be writing something, whether you feel you're genre hopping or not. If that's what you're passionate about, always be writing something. And then the way I targeted my brand and my pitches, I have 2 or 3 different kinds. I would focus on my comedy with people that were looking for comedy. I would focus on my horror, my sci-fi, my sci-fi with the people that were looking for those. So I would research the company, research the people that I'm going to be pitching to, see what they were interested, and wherever you get your breakthrough, that's where you get your breakthrough. So cast your net wide. If you have a lot of different genres, there's nothing wrong with that. But once you break in, like for me, it was horror. Then you also have to realize that your options to genre hop are going to be limited for at least a little while, depending on how successful you are, because once you're known as the guy or the gal that does this thing, that's what's going to get you other work. Gigs beget gigs, so to speak, is the thing I always used as a musician. You go play a good show, somebody else wants to book you, right? But you went and played that show as a jazz band, they're not going to want to book you as a heavy metal band. They're going to want to book you as a jazz band. So if you get that gig as a horror writer or a comedy writer, your next job more than likely is going to be as a horror writer or a comedy writer, and you need to roll with that. And, maybe later on, if you've got those other types of scripts on the back burner, you'll get the opportunity to bring those forward. But once you get your foot in the door, I mean, don't get pissed off if you wrote a horror movie and somebody else doesn't want to see your, you know, period drama, romantic comedy. So.
Okay. And then what is, you know, sort of picking your brain, if someone was considering maybe making a micro budget feature as a way to get your work out there, have you ever had any experience doing that? Or do you know of others who have maybe taken that route and had some success?
I know it's like Saw is probably the perfect example, right? Like they originally make that for like $20,000, and then they got it made, and I think it's Saw.
I mean, I know there's a few films, unfortunately, I'm blanking on the names, but like these sort of like proof of concepts, or like a micro budget feature that then, you know, gets acquired and scaled up. But yeah, so do you know, I mean, personally, anybody who has sort of done that, or sort of, do you think it's worthwhile for some folks to try that?
That's not the route that I took, because I'm not a filmmaker. I'm pretty much just a writer. But there's a guy actually I know here locally in Boise where I live, who's from Buffalo. He's been here a while. He just had something. He's doing exactly what you're talking about. He micro-budgeted his own film, and they're showing it here locally and trying to get it into some film festivals. But just from my knowledge of the industry, nobody personally other than him, but I know that people have done that before, got them into film festivals. If you're lucky, get it in Toronto, get into Sundance, Cannes, wherever you can get into, and then use that as a stepping stone to keep leveling up. So yeah, of course that's possible. And if you have the means, the resources, and the passion to do that, then there's no reason, in my opinion, not to. But, you know, make it good, get it to the right people, know your genre, like know what you're actually shooting for. And if you know those things, you feel good about them, that's great. I'm not trying to imply that people don't, who go and make these micro budgets, but like for me at any rate, it was really important for me to understand the genre, to understand the industry, and to get that feedback from professional people before I personally would even attempt something like that. But if you have the vision and have the means, and you can do that and you make something good, yeah, go for it. Why not?
I'm curious, obviously you have your literary manager now. Do you also have a entertainment attorney at this point, or not yet?
No, I don't have an entertainment attorney. I have a lot of legal people in my family. So if I have questions, I just ask them.
Okay.
And then in terms of being an agent, I'm good enough in front of people. I'm good enough in a room. I'm just kind of my own agent. You know, whether it's through Skype, I still use roadmaps to pitch to people. I mean, just because I have a manager and I'm working on this project, if I look through the pitch sessions every month, I'm like, oh, I would like to pitch one of our projects to this guy. And my manager's okay with that. We just communicate, you know, like, hey, here's the people I'm thinking about pitching to this month. And he's like, okay, this person, yes, not that person. I actually know them. I'll reach out to them. And we just make sure we're on the same page with where we're putting the work out to. But we work as a team. And that's what you're going to be doing whenever you do have a literary manager or an agent or whatever, is you guys work as a team.
Cool. What I was going to ask was also in terms of, you know, let's say you're a writer and you have a couple of, let's say you're new to it and you have 2 completed scripts and you're looking to sort of get your work out there. And let's say you had contacts or relationships to folks with different film festivals. You know, is that like, I think I already know your answer to this, but it's, you know, would you email those people or try to reach out to any sort of industry relationships that you have early on? Or did you do that? Like reach out to folks that you knew early on?
I had to learn people as I went. I didn't really know anybody, you know, early on, especially coming from Boise, Idaho, when I first got into this. And I did live in Northern California for a while, but I was up near the Oregon border, you know, behind the redwood curtain, as they call it, there in hippie country. So I didn't really have any contacts. If you have contacts and you just have a script and they're involved in the if they're involved in the film festival, then you don't try to like work your relationship with them to win a film festival per se. I think that's in bad taste. If you have relationships or have people that are involved in the industry, I think what you want is the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I don't not try to tie it to the festival. Like if you want to enter in the festival, then I wouldn't bother them if you enter in the festival, because I think that's a conflict of interest myself, and that crosses a certain line. If there's a judging contest in a festival and you know one of the judges or the filmmakers, I think it's bad form to reach out to them or to try to solicit them in any way because you've entered their festival. But if you're just looking for their feedback on a project and they're willing to give it, that's great. But don't cross those boundaries, in my opinion.
In terms of writing on spec, what sort of schedule and deadlines do you set for yourself? Like, how do you hold yourself accountable?
Everybody's going to write it knowing how fast you do write. If you write on spec, if you've never written on spec before, you have to be really honest with yourself, first of all, before you do write on spec. Because if it's a writing assignment, you got to make sure that you're in bed with that before you write it. And that's where I'm good and honest, because I tell people right up front, it's like, no, I'm excited to hear about the project. Let's talk about it. And if it's not something that I feel like in my wheelhouse, most of the time they're not going to come to you if they haven't already read something and think that it's going to be in your wheelhouse or think that you're a good fit. But if you hear it and you're just really not into it, I would say tread very carefully with that. And if it means you don't accept it, that's fine. You can say no. You can say, you know what, this really doesn't resonate with me. If you feel like you have to because it's your opportunity, I understand that as well. And give it everything you got, but know how fast you typically write. Like, how long does it take you to write one of your own scripts? Like, because whenever you're writing on spec, it's not just like, oh, here's an idea, go write the script. Like, there's a treatment involved usually, and you guys go back and forth on that treatment or the outline, and you're really talking it through and understanding who these characters are. What is the story that we're going through? And you've got a pretty good idea of what those beats are going to be and what that outline is going to be before you actually start writing the script. Script I'm working on right now. We've been going back and forth on the treatment for about a month. We got to the point between me, him, and my manager where we're like, okay, I think we're ready to start writing the script now. Once it got to that point, I wrote the script in a week and a half for a draft. So the script was written in a week and a half just because I had it all in my brain after a month of going back and forth and talking about it. And, you know, clap on the back, thank fucking goodness. Like, he loved the first draft. He's like, oh my God, I can't believe you wrote this in a freaking week and a half. This is amazing. But there was still a page this long of notes about, oh, let's change this. Here's a typo here. You know, no matter how many times you reread it, there's still going to be typos. That's just the nature of the beast, right? But there's still a page of notes. Rewrote the second. We called it version 1.2. Still another page of notes. And then and now we're like to the point after 2 weeks, since originally, like, I've almost got a product that we both feel good enough about that we can take to my manager and start taking to other people after only 2 weeks. But that's after a month of going back and forth on the original concept and making sure that we really were all on the same page with it. Right. So if you're the type of writer that you can do that, that's how it worked out for me. But if you're the type of writer where it takes you 3 months, or if it takes you 30 days, if it takes you 2 days, know yourself and communicate that openly with your manager or whoever you're working with so that they have realistic expectations. So I guess sorry for all the talking. Don't set unrealistic expectations. Yeah. Know who you are, know how long it takes, and make sure you communicate that openly. And then it can go, you know, it can take however long it takes, as long as everybody's on the same page.
Right. And then in terms of sort of your manager, is there ever sort of this expectation in terms of, you know, when or how much original material they would like you to generate at any point? Like, do you ever have conversations like that, or is that expectation ever set?
No, I mean, I already had 10, 11 scripts whenever I got signed by my manager. So I had a body of work. I think it's important to have a body of work. In terms of them wanting you to write more original material. If you only have 1 or 2 scripts, and you should always be writing. It really is the bottom line. Even if you have 1 script, if you're working on something, because that's a question you're going to get in meetings with agents, managers, execs, producers, directors, etc. Sometimes is, what are you working on now? So always have that. Even if you haven't put pen to paper, so to speak, yet, you should at least have that idea in your mind that you're working on. So as long as you're working on something now, I don't think it necessarily matters how big your body of work is. Just be working on something now.
And then do you only develop original ideas, or do you ever develop anything based on IP? And sort of what are your thoughts on that?
IP is big right now. If you can get something that's based on IP and get that option for it if you need to, if it's something more than a news article, that's only going to help you, because IP is huge. Myself, some of my ideas are completely original. A couple of them I have done off IP, but it wasn't anything that I had to option. It was either a news article or a song even, or, you know, just whatever it was, but it's something that was in the zeitgeist that you could go, hey, you know, it's not this book or this comic book type
It's
IP.
not specific to one thing. It's just sort of just in terms of where you were inspired from.
Right. Or a news article. You know, a news article you don't necessarily have to IP, but it can be, you know, something like that. But no, bottom line, if you can get it, it's not going to hurt you.
Okay. And then in terms of sort of writing throughout your writing process, is there sort of an average number of drafts that you usually write for a particular project?
No, I would say there's an average number. I've written, like, one of the ones I just finished reading. I've been screwing around with that stupid thing for 6 or 7 years, and finally got it to a place where I felt reasonably good about it. And then there's other things that just flew out in a couple weeks to 30 days. So not every project's going to be the same, and I don't think that's how fast it comes out of your noggin isn't really any way to gauge it. That doesn't necessarily make it better. It doesn't necessarily make it worse. But once it does come out, understanding the craft. Again, you can be good with a saw, you can be good with a hammer, but that doesn't mean you know how to build a house. So as long as you understand where those beats, what we're supposed to see by page 10, are we supposed to be page 30? And it's okay if you want to go outside the established beat sheet or where those beats are supposed to fall. But if you do go outside that, you damn well better know how to explain it. And as long as you can do that, it's like, well, I know that it's supposed to land here, here, and here, but I did this, this, and this because of this, this, and this, and this is why I did that. If you can explain all that, great. But you got to know how to, build your foundation stuff before you put the roof on, so to speak. So there you go, back to my building analogies. But yeah, that's my answer there.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, and sort of like as we get ready to sort of wrap up, I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit about the project now? I don't know how much details you can share, but what are you working on right now?
Well, actually I need to send Tim the draft I finished today, which we're calling it version 1.3. But it's a horror movie, and David Whitney is who I'm working with on it. He's a director, producer. I talked to him a couple of weeks ago. He was coming from Sam Raimi's house. So Joe, my manager, very highly touted him as like one of the up-and-coming premier guys in the horror genre. So very excited to be working with him. And it's a project that's based on the opioid crisis. So that's kind of the most thing I can talk about it right now probably is we wanted to take – because obviously a lot of films, like there's either something that's in the zeitgeist, the social element to it, or something relative, that you want to kind of draw on. Horror actually does that more than what people realize, at least subconsciously. And that's how the execs, the producers, the directors are going to approach those concepts, especially in horror, is they like grounded, but they like grounded elevated. So something that's rooted, but also has this elevated factor to it. If you don't know what grounded elevated means in film, then there's some research for you to be doing, like know what grounded is, especially with sci-fi, horror, fantasy. What's grounded? What's elevated? What's grounded elevated? What's a two-hander? There's just like look up those terminologies, understand how they work, because again, you can do what you want, but you need to be able to explain it in a way that conforms with that industry jargon, whether you like it or not, because that's what enables you to get your work looked at and makes them understand what you're talking about. But yeah, it's about the opioid crisis and about people in Florida, especially Florida. They call it the Florida Shuffle. So these opioid addicts, their insurance company pays for their rehab, and you have people called body brokers who basically facilitate these people into these rehab facilities. So they first go to a transfer facility for a couple days, sometimes just a shitty hotel. Then they go to a rehab for a few months. After that, they go to what's called a sober house, where 9 times out of 10, they have access to the same drugs that got them hooked. and they get hooked all over again, rinse, wash, repeat. And that's how these body brokers defraud the insurance agency and keep people addicted at the same time. It's called the Shuffle, or the Florida Shuffle. So this film is based on a body broker who, that's what he does for a living. He shuffles these people around for profit. And it's a horror movie where this particular body broker also has a supernatural element to him that I won't go too much into, where he's basically feeding off of these people and using, so it ties into that opioid crisis, social, predicament, social crisis mechanism, and ties into that inner fear there as well.
Cool. That sounds awesome. Yeah, well, Travis, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Really appreciate it. Good luck on your next draft. Hopefully, would you say 1.3? Is that that's this one?
That's what David said. I had version 3. He's like, let's just call it 1.3. Like, we really haven't changed that much. It's just like the bones were solid. We're just giving it muscle, and now we're giving it connective tissue. So it's 1.3.
Love it. Well, thank you again. And, it's been great, having had the opportunity to read your work over these last, year or so. And I'm just so happy to see that, things are just really moving in the right direction for you. So, and thanks for sharing, your insights and your perspectives with everyone. So really appreciate it again.
Oh, no, thank you. And thank you, Roadmaps, because without you guys, maybe it would have still been possible, but somehow I think it probably would have taken a bit longer. I don't know. I'm just glad for where I'm at, and thankful for all the knowledge and good relationships that it's created.
We appreciate it.
It's valuable.
Really appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks so much, and wishing everybody a great Sunday afternoon. Take care.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you guys. You guys have a good night.